2 of our series, Challenging Authority. Hard pass, why so many people dismiss the Bible. That's our topic for today. In weeks 3 to 5, so next week and the couple weeks after that, we're really going to get into the details of how we got the Bible, the evidence for its accuracy, and the integrity of its transmission. But before we get into that, all of that stuff, I thought that it was really important and it would make sense for us to review some of the key reasons why people write the Bible off. Because we know that this is true, and a lot of people do this. And I've found that some of us have so much of a predisposed aversion to the Bible that we have a hard time entering into a proper investigation of its credibility. I really think that that is true for a lot of people. So I thought it would make sense for us to take some time today and just address some of the roadblocks that cause this aversion in so many people. I don't expect to be able to completely change anyone's opinion in the short time that we have here today, but I do hope to at least demonstrate that there are logical responses to the accusations that are made against the Bible. And maybe it will help some people through this series just to be a little bit more open-minded as it relates to the Bible. A little disclaimer as we get into today's topic, although the discussion is on the Bible, I won't be using much of the Bible this morning, okay? So I'm just warning you ahead of time. But it's all very important stuff we really need to be taking the time to discuss and understand. So why do so many people dismiss the Bible? I'm going to give you 4 big reasons today. The first one I would call supernatural claims and miracles. Many people write off the Bible because it treats supernatural events as having really happened. And these folk don't see, miracles happening today. And so they look at the Bible and say, well, this must just be a book of myths, right? It must just be fiction, literature. C.S. Lewis, the famous theologian, addressed these ideas in his book way back in 1947 called Miracles, a Preliminary Study. And he said disbelief in miracles usually stems not from historical or scientific analysis, but from a prior philosophical commitment to naturalism. Now, naturalism, of course, is this idea that nothing exists beyond the natural world, right? If you can't experience it with your 5 senses, then it doesn't exist. And this has become a predominant philosophy in our world today and since the time of the Enlightenment. Lewis had some pretty compelling arguments to those who write off miracles. First of all, miracles are not irrational if God exists. Because think about it, God, by definition, is supernatural. He's outside of that which we can experience with our 5 senses. So if God exists, then the whole idea of miracles really shouldn't be that big a problem for us. Lewis said that God creates natural laws, but he has the ability, of course, to intervene when he chooses to do so and to do something that is supernatural. So people need to begin by deciding if they believe God exists or not. And we've talked about that already. Keep in mind that if God doesn't exist, think about this, then your own reasoning processes are nothing more than the product of random chance, right? And so your own thinking really can't be trusted either. Furthermore, if you do have a functioning mind that exists without a designer, well, that's a miracle in itself. So we all believe in miracles, right? We just choose which miracles we believe in. That's the fact. The same is true of the creation of the world. Whether God did it, or whether it happened by, this random explosion of gases that came from who knows where, well, that's still a miracle. And so we're choosing which miracle we want to believe in. Now, the frequency of miracles that the Bible portrays can be an issue for some people, since it doesn't seem to match up with what we see or experience today on a day-to-day basis. And I understand that, and I appreciate it, and I've wrestled with this question myself. There are some interesting things here to consider that I will share with you that helped me in this process as I was trying to make sense of all of this. First of all, there are only about 80 to 90 miracles mentioned in the Old Testament. About 35 to 40 that are attributed to Jesus, and another 20 or so that we see by the apostles who came immediately after Jesus. So that's less than about 150 miracles over a period of, let's say, 2,200 years, right? If we're going from the time of Moses to the time of the early church. Really, a number of the miracles recorded in the Bible actually go back, a couple thousand years earlier than that, if you're going right back to the time of Adam and Eve. So if you were to actually chart this, you would see that we're only talking about one miracle every 15 years, if you're looking all the way back to the time of creation, one maybe every 30 years. And there are some long periods in between these gaps where there are no recorded miracles at all. And so I actually charted this out. There's a bunch here at the time of the patriarchs, but then there's a huge gap, by the time you get to the Exodus, a few around the time of Joshua, a bunch during the time of the Judges. You keep going and they kind of happen in little bunches, right? Then you have like this huge gap before the time of Jesus, and that's Jesus' life right there, that little bit. And then after that, the apostles. So there are long gaps in history where there are no recorded miracles at all. And so the fact that we may feel that we don't see a lot today doesn't say that they didn't ever exist or that we won't see them again at some point. There's also arguments to be made that there may be miracles happening all of the time. Now, you might be surprised to know that Christians are not quick to accept miracles either. Sometimes Christians have this reputation as, we just latch on to any sort of idea that floats by. No, we're really not that way. In fact, we reject many texts because of their fantastical nature. We're going to look at that next week, at the rejected books, the ones that didn't make it into the Bible, the hidden gospels that people talk about. We'll get into the details of why we don't believe them. And they come down to, these issues very often of the supernatural. So I want to challenge you, if you've never done a proper study on this, I would challenge you, compare the Genesis creation account with the Gilgamesh epic, right? Or other, ancient accounts. Compare the stories in the Old Testament with the book of Enoch or Balaam the dragon or some of these other books that were not included in the Old Testament. Just compare them. I'm telling you, you will see a very, stark difference. Compare the gospels that are in the Bible with the rejected gospels that didn't make it into the Bible, and you will see there is a very noted difference. Miracles in the Bible appear in what we call historical narrative. That means it's relaying factual information, and it's treated as fact, historical fact. And they serve a specific purpose. So note this, if you're taking notes, believers in the Bible understand that miracles are not random magic tricks, but meaningful signs that were used at specific times in history for God's purposes. There was a purpose behind each of these miracles. They're not just like these random things that happen like you see in some of these other books that were not included in the Bible. When you examine them, you see that they actually make sense, the ones that are in our Bible. God was doing something when he allowed these miracles to take place. Think about it. He was preserving his nation. So when you see all of these plagues, when Moses is taking the Israelites out of Egypt, it was to preserve his nation, his people, from whom the Messiah, who would provide salvation, was going to come. So it was very important at that moment in history. He used miracles to affirm his word through the prophets. So when you see Elijah calling fire down out of heaven to destroy the prophets of Baal, right? Well, that was to preserve his word at a very key time in history. When he's demonstrating his divinity through Jesus, it was important that Jesus demonstrated that he was God, and so he performed miracles so people could see that he actually was who he said he was. And when the apostles were affirming, or when they were proclaiming the gospel, God affirmed that message by allowing them to perform miracles because the Bible itself wasn't completed yet, right? So he affirmed the message that they were giving by giving them the ability to perform miracles. So in the Bible, what you see is that there's always a reason for these miracles, and it's very specific, and it follows a pattern, and it's following a storyline. The truth is, though, guys, most Christians remain very skeptical about miracles even today. We don't just latch on to anything. And so note, Christianity has always been an evidence-based faith. If you're taking notes, underline that, write that down. We are an evidence-based faith. We believe in the supernatural, but we also embrace rational thinking, verifiable history, and the scientific method. We're happy to discuss what we can learn from history about things like the resurrection, right? We want to provide evidence that that happened because we're an evidence-based faith. And Christians actually fueled scientific discovery. Famous scientists like Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, Pascal, Boyle, Newton, Faraday, Mendel, Kelvin, these were all Christian men. They're all Christian men. They're the ones that got science rolling, as We came through the Enlightenment period and science really started to take off. In fact, a study has shown that 65.4% of the Nobel Prize laureates in the 20th century identified Christianity as their religious preference. 2/3 of these great scientists through from 1900 to 2000 identified as Christian, right? So understand, we're not anti-science. Many brilliant Christian scientists continue to believe in miracles because they reject the notion of naturalism. They say, yeah, I work with the scientific method and I believe in that, but I'm not saying that that's all there is. I'm not keeping this box closed to the possibility of God or what God can do in our midst. That doesn't make these people anti-science. They're in fact brilliant scientists. So think about it, guys. This is important philosophically to consider. For someone who is not open to the idea of the supernatural, a miracle can never exist, right? If your box is closed to the possibility of the supernatural, then even if a miracle happens, you cannot acknowledge that it happened, right? That's just a logical point. One could very well happen, but a naturalist would not be allowed to admit it. Maybe they're still happening all of the time, but we just refuse to acknowledge them. Very possibly. The bottom line is this: don't let the miracles in the Bible discourage you from believing in it, right? There's no reason to do that. It's not necessary. There are still some miracles, I will be quick to confess, that really still make me scratch my head, right? The sun standing still in the book of Joshua, I still go, that's crazy, right? But once you believe that God created the entire world ex nihilo, right, out of nothing by the power of his word, then these things don't become such a huge issue because we know anything is possible. And you may be surprised to know that many Christians even struggle with the miracles that they see in the Bible. More and more I'm seeing Christians today that are trying to explain away these miracles that we've always just said, well, yeah, God did that. And they're trying to come up with natural explanations. It's kind of sad. It's actually a little bit silly because the best parts of the Bible are the miracles, in case you didn't know. They're the reason why we gather together on Sunday morning. They're the reason why we practice our faith, right? They're the reason why we believe. Think about it. The creation, God made that, right? Out of nothing. God bringing the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses receiving the 10 Commandments. Jesus walking on water. The resurrection from the dead, right? These are the great miracles that form the foundation of our faith. They're not a reason not to believe. They're the reason why we believe. Well, you can't be a Christian without being a supernaturalist. And that's why I challenged you last week to consider, I hope you did your homework, is it logical that God would reveal himself to us? If God exists, is it logical to think that he would reveal himself to us? Once you agree that that's logical, miracles are really not that big of an obstacle. Also, once you understand what God is doing through history, you can see the specific purpose of the miracles that he chooses to allow. And it gives you a framework for understanding, what makes sense, even for the people that made the decisions about which books to give authority to or not. You can very, very quickly start to understand why some books were given credibility and others were not. All right, the second thing that people would give a hard pass to the Bible for would be the moral and ethical concerns that get raised. Now, we're all children of the era in which we live, and the truth is that people really didn't question miracles much at all until the Enlightenment. So we're talking about, the mid-1600s or so. From that point on, these things started to become questioned more. It was around that same time that people started questioning the morality that they saw in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. Over the past 400 years or so, critics have highlighted difficult passages that seem to condone things like slavery, like violence or genocide, the subjugation of women, right? Some of these things that have really become hot topics. And they argue that these undermine the Bible's moral authority and even its divine inspiration. They would say, how can we trust a book that supports so many immoral actions? Or how can we believe that this actually came from God? And guys, these are legitimate questions that Christians should have, responses to, thoughtful responses to. I will try to give you some here in the next few minutes. Let's talk about slavery for a minute, because this is a big one. The Old Testament often takes heat as condoning slavery because under the law, rules were given on how to treat slaves. In other words, the Bible's position was more regulation than it was elimination. You understand? So that's kind of the heat that the Bible takes. It's like, why didn't God just eliminate it all right from the beginning? Well, first of all, understand, slavery was commonplace in the ancient Near East. It was not race-based, as we tend to think of it. It was not chattel slavery, as was practiced in the Americas. So you have to understand that right away. Your idea that you have about slavery is not what was going on in the ancient Near East, okay? In the Old Testament world, slavery was more like indentured servitude. It was economic in nature, where a person would sell himself into slavery to pay off a debt. Others became slaves through war, right? So when a conquering nation came through, rather than killing everyone off, they said, who would like to be our slave instead? And everyone said, I would, right? So that was kind of the way people became slaves. Well, in the New Testament, as much as a third of the entire Roman Empire was slaves. And not just, laborers. They could be doctors or teachers or accountants, right? They were members of society. It had nothing to do with race. And so most people who denigrate the Bible over slavery haven't really done a thorough study on it. But let me give you some things that, the Bible has addressed. First of all, God didn't abolish it probably for very practical reasons. Most historians agree that simply abolishing slavery instantly at that time would have resulted in the complete collapse of the society. You can imagine, especially like in Roman times when literally a third of the people are slaves. And so it would have ruined life for everybody, those that had slaves and those who were slaves. And so it wouldn't have made sense to do it that quickly. Secondly, God did set the moral trajectory. Although he didn't just eliminate it completely, immediately, he did set the moral trajectory. First of all, he chose to redeem a slave nation. A lot of Christians don't even take the time to give this consideration, right? Think about what God did. He redeemed a slave nation. This set the foundation for everything that God was doing in the world, and he did it through Israel, this nation that were slaves that he brought out of bondage. He's showing his attitude towards slavery. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, he says, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And everything that he commands of the Israelites from that point on is through this framework. He says, listen, remember that you were slaves, and now treat people in the way that I have treated you in bringing you out of bondage. And so there was an important lesson that God was using slavery to teach, and an important idea, a bigger idea that he was imparting to us. Secondly, he gave regulations to the Israelites in the Old Testament. You might be surprised at how many regulations he gave regarding slavery. Did you know that slaves in Israel had to be released every 6 years? Exodus chapter 21. They had to be freed if the master inflicted any permanent injury on the slave. Immediately they had to be freed. Runaway slaves were not to be reported or returned. So if someone saw one that had run away and you came across them, you couldn't report them, you couldn't return them. They were free to go. Slaves were to enjoy the Sabbath like free people were. Every 50th year was called a year of Jubilee, and all Israelite slaves were to be freed every 50th year. They wanted to make sure that this was not something that continued on. And so people that had to fall into slavery to pay off debts and so on, every 50th year, they had to be freed. Wouldn't you love it if every 50th year we had a year of Jubilee and all of your credit card debt was gone? That was more merciful back there of what was happening than how we live today. Good luck if you think that's ever going to happen today, right? The justice system also applied equally to slaves. We see in Numbers chapter 15 that you could actually go before the court as a slave and had your case heard and have justice applied to your situation. And so there were a number of regulations given in the Old Testament. Thirdly, and this is very important, God's heart became crystal clear in the gospel. When you look at Isaiah 61 and how Jesus quoted that in Luke chapter 4, look at what he says. He says, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives. Right? The heart of the gospel is this idea of God bringing freedom to enslaved people. This is what he always intended to do. Now, God knew that he had to get to the heart not just impose rules as it relates to slavery. Guys, you know that every country in the world has rules today against human trafficking, against sex trafficking, but it's happening all over the place. It's rampant. There are close to 5 million people today tied up in this across the world. It's running rampant. Why is that happening? We have rules. It's happening because we have not captured God's heart in this matter, the heart of Jesus. The world has cast off Jesus' thinking and his teaching on these things. Well, the third thing that I would mention is that God's people led the charge to abolish slavery. It was actually Christian men who finally abolished it. William Wilberforce, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, of course. These were the ones, all Christian men, who resulted in it actually being abolished. While many countries today have placed limits on slavery, historian Tom Holland boldly claims, look at this, there has never been an abolition movement that wasn't Judeo-Christian. In many parts of the world today, slavery still exists. It's managed, right? But not necessarily completely abolished. Tom Holland, who has studied this really well, says everywhere that it has been abolished, it is because of the Judeo-Christian influence. In other words, places where slavery has been completely abolished, it was always the result of biblical ideas. Very important to understand. So the bottom line is, guys, that the topic of slavery is not the best line of attack to use against the Bible, right? If you are wanting to attack the Bible, I'm not handing out tips on how to attack the Bible, but if you were, this is really not the best line of thinking to use, because the Bible taught us about Jesus, that teaches us about the value of the individual that actually resulted in the end of slavery, right? Well, let's talk about violence and genocide, because this is another one that is very popular. Again, the Bible is often criticized as condoning wholesale genocide. The main examples that tend to get mentioned are the Canaanites, the Amalekites, and the Midianites when you look at the Bible and Israel's violence against them. In every case, God uses one of his prophets, Moses or Samuel, to decree destruction to those people groups. Here's the thing, guys, and maybe if you've been to university, you've probably heard a lot of things about these types of things. University professors will never take the time to explain to you why God would have led, Israel to do such a thing. Let me give you one example. The most prominent example, which is the Canaanites. When they entered the promised land, they completely displaced the Canaanites. The Canaanites were committed to demonic, occultic practices, rampant sexual depravity, and child sacrifice, widespread child sacrifice, where they would literally throw their babies into fires to be burned alive for the gods Moloch and Baal. This is what went on all of the time in this society. And this is why God had Israel root them out completely. Now, some people will say, well, what about the little children, the innocent children that would be killed as Israel rooted them out? Well, obviously, that's a terrible thing. But we know in the real world, this fallen world in which we live, children always have to pay the price for their parents' bad decisions. Always. I mean, look around the world today. It continues to happen today. It doesn't make it a good thing, obviously. But secondly, we have to remember that God has an eternal perspective of things, right? He hasn't forgotten those children. Don't ever think that for a second. In fact, Jesus was the one who said, speaking of the kingdom of heaven, right? And speaking of children, he says, of such is the kingdom of heaven, right? There's going to be a lot of kids in heaven, in his kingdom. Remember, God himself committed genocide in the flood and against Sodom and Gomorrah. And there were lots of kids involved in that too. He's God. He has the right to do these things. And there will be more judgment coming against those that rebel against him. The Bible says that's not finished. There's more that's coming someday. People who commit genocide today, they don't have Moses or Samuel to vouch for them, right? Obviously. And so anybody that would engage in anything like that has to be extremely careful and expect God's judgment to come against them. This is not something that God approves of, but in certain cases in history, he's done this. Here's the fact, guys. There can come a time when a society is so depraved that the entire world is at risk of being infected by it, right? And so you just have to acknowledge this. And God, in his mercy, sometimes takes drastic action. And there are points in history where he's done this. Let's talk about the subjugation of women. This is another popular criticism related to the Bible. The main accusation is that women are treated as inferior to men, especially in terms of leadership. And we could obviously go into a whole long study on this. That's not the purpose in this series. Ultimately, if you study it thoroughly, what you'll see is that the Bible treats men and women as equal but different, right? Equal but different. It prescribes that men take the highest leadership in two places specifically, in the home and in the church. Those are the two places, which are both family dynamics, family environments, right? The home and in the church. Women who have children are specifically told to prioritize them in their home life. We see that in Titus chapter 2. But women are free to do anything that men do, right up to being CEO of a company or president of a country. If you read Proverbs 31, you'll see that women are not withheld from doing anything that men do. Yes, wives are asked to submit to their husbands. We see in Ephesians chapter 5, again in that home context. But remember, husbands are asked to love their wives as Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? He laid down his life for the church. So husbands are actually called to the higher responsibility of sacrificing themselves completely for their wives. That's the part that people don't talk about, right, when they're making these arguments. Well, many scholars agree that the Bible was actually radically countercultural in its time for honoring and protecting women, and that Jesus elevated the status of women. Prior to the time of Jesus, women were always considered inferior to men. Catherine Bushnell, who lived from 1855 to 1946, was a well-known medical doctor, a Christian writer, a social activist, and actually a forerunner of feminist theology. She said this: the Bible is not the cause of women's subjection, but her deliverance. Right? A woman who was both a feminist and who understood the Bible said that the Bible is not the cause of women's subjection, but of her deliverance. And I would offer that the Bible has done much more to improve life for women than even the feminist movement has done. Now, feminism is a complex study for sure, but numerous studies have shown that women's happiness has actually declined since feminism became popular in the 1970s. A widely cited 2009 study by Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers from the University of Pennsylvania found this, that women's happiness has declined both absolutely and relative to men in the United States and several other Western countries since the 1970s. And numerous studies are showing this to be true. And the other thing that we see is that religious women in America consistently report being happier than irreligious ones. And in America, when we're talking about religion, we're predominantly talking about the Bible, right? There's a Pew Research study in 2019, a Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health study in 2018. The Institute of Family Studies released a study in 2022, all saying the same thing, that religious women in America are happier. Well, why? Well, maybe the Bible's advice as it relates to women isn't as bad as people are saying. Personally, and this is totally anecdotal, but the happiest and most fulfilled women that I know are Bible-believing women who live by this book. So I would just encourage you to reconsider it. A third reason why people give a hard pass to the Bible would be cultural and contextual limitations. And some would argue that the Bible reflects the cultural and social limitations of its time rather than divine wisdom, making it outdated, making it irrelevant. That's a common, accusation. They would say, how can we trust a book that promotes ideas that are clearly outdated or culturally bound? It's a good question. Well, we've already, looked at a few things that could be considered culturally outdated. Some others would include this list of things: sexual ethics, modesty, corporal punishment, pornography, LGBTQ plus issues, right? There are a number of things that people would put in this category today. Over the course of my life, I've seen many people write the Bible off because it didn't keep up with the times, especially as it relates to some of these topics. But here's the interesting thing. In the last 10 years or so, I have seen so many people, not necessarily Christian people, but so many people make a complete 180 on this, a complete reversal of opinions. The whole idea that Christians have, talked about no sex outside of marriage or before marriage, right, was considered so ridiculous from the 60s on. It was just sort of something that we've been mocked for. But now people are seeing the physical and emotional health benefits, right? The benefits to the family structure, the benefits to society when these rules are in place. You could talk about modesty and pornography, but now we're seeing parents, having their kids objectified, just acting in completely inappropriate ways on social media. They're young girls signing up to literally be someone's personal prostitute on OnlyFans. A lot of parents don't even know this is happening. It's going on all over the place. It's rampant. So maybe some of these rules on, modesty and pornography, maybe we should have, followed the Bible's advice on these things. The other crazy part is on the other extreme, you'll see people walking around that are completely covered, women that are only showing this much of their face. The Bible doesn't condone that either. The Bible says that's degrading to women, right? Women are equal to men. They should be able to walk around and show their face, right? And so somewhere here, there's a middle ground, and a lot of people are coming back and saying, yeah, this is actually what, I've believed all along. The whole issue of corporal punishment, spanking your kids from the time that I was, a kid, that sort of became less and less popular. When I was, how many of you still remember the strap in school? At least it hung up somewhere where everyone could see, so you could tell stories. Yeah, we've really used that thing, right? Over time, that just kind of went away. And so there's no control in schools now. They can't even get anything done in public schools now. Ask people that work in the public schools, they'll tell you there's not much stuff getting done. Kids are unable to regulate themselves. We could talk about LGBTQ plus issues. We can be compassionate, and Christians need to be compassionate in these areas, but still hold on to biblical standards. Now, guys, so we have kids that are mutilating themselves with parents approving it, cutting off body parts, men playing women's sports and being in women's locker rooms. It's gone to this crazy other place. Well, biblical standards, they stand the test of time, and many people are just recognizing their benefit. And I'm seeing so many people returning now to these biblical ideas. I recognize that there are some laws in the Old Testament, particularly purity and dietary laws, that are a little more obscure, right? That you can take some time and study. Why couldn't they eat lobster in the Old Testament, right? Well, the Bible itself addresses those already. You do have to read the entire book, guys, when it comes to these things, right? If you're going to read what's in the Old Testament, read the New Testament as well and see how those things get addressed. The final category here of why people give a hard pass to the Bible and dismiss it would be historical and scientific accuracy. Some claim that the Bible contradicts established historical and scientific knowledge, such as the age of the earth, the global flood, certain events in biblical history for which there's little or no archaeological evidence. And so the question they would ask is, how can we trust a book that contains historical and scientific inaccuracies? Well, first, the Bible doesn't claim to actually give the age of the earth. It shows human civilization as being young, like maybe around 6,000 years. But that's not far off from what a lot of scientists would actually say. Historical evidence and carbon dating render a pretty broad range of possibilities. I was actually looking at something this week that actually said the only thing that can really give you a true rendering of how old civilization is recorded writing, which actually goes back to not more than 2,500 years BC. You know that? This was a respected scientist that was saying this. There is very strong evidence for a global flood. In fact, there are over 200 flood mythologies worldwide with striking similarities. You say, how's that possible? Over 200. Well, most likely because it really happened. And those stories got carried on. Now, they get distorted over time. We believe that the biblical account is the correct one. And I would challenge you, go and look at some of these mythologies, and you will see that the Bible's story is the most robust, the most clear, makes sense, and that we believe the other ones were offshoots of the actual event that happened that is recorded in the Bible. Historians like Graham Hancock, who you maybe have seen, his show Ancient Apocalypse is on Netflix. It's very interesting. Historians like this give strong evidence that ancient humans were extremely intelligent, just like the Bible describes. His explanation of a global cataclysm aligns very well with the idea of Noah's flood. He even discusses historical evidence for the existence of giants, just like the Bible talks about in Genesis. And also the commonality of engravings and inscriptions on structures all over the world is kind of interesting. It aligns with the idea that the world maybe at one point was one large landmass prior to the flood. I mean, you can look at these things. This one's particularly interesting, where you have these figures with seven serpent heads, and it's in Mexico and India. Now, those places are really far apart and really separated. Well, how are they designing the exact same things in these different places? It's a very interesting study. Obviously, many people attack the Bible when it comes to the theory of evolution versus creation, but I've taught many classes on this over the years here at Renew, and I'm happy to meet with anyone, anytime, to discuss this because it's actually a personal passion of mine. And a number of you are smiling because you know this is true. I've tracked with it over the years, and I've really studied it at a deep level. Modern DNA evidence has made it absolutely clear that transspeciation is and always has been impossible. Now, natural selection, some variation among species, absolutely that happens. But the idea that one species becomes another species, there's no evidence for it. In fact, the DNA evidence that we have now shows that it is absolutely impossible. And scientists they're latching onto this. They're seeing we can't deny this anymore. There's virtually no fossil evidence that can be used to support this idea of transspeciation. So archaeology actually aligns with the biblical account. Most people are surprised to know that archaeologists around the world rely more heavily on the Bible than any other book for their digs. How do they know where to look for certain things? Well, the greatest history book that we have is the Bible that records ancient history. They're using the Bible all of the time. Well, as the world's top biologists are now openly admitting, Darwinian evolution has never worked. In 2009, a respected journalist named Susan Mazur released a book called The Altenberg 16, an expose of the evolution industry. The story was that she heard that the top biologists were getting together in this place in Austria called Altenberg, and that they were questioning the theory of evolution. She thought, this is a juicy story. She wanted to go and report it. When they heard that she wanted to, they barred her from coming. She was not happy. So she said, fine, I'll go and interview all of the top biologists that you didn't invite. And this is what she did. And you want to see some of the quotes that she came back with? Take a look. Basically, I don't think anybody knows how evolution works, Jerry Fodor said. Oh, sure, natural selection's been demonstrated. The interesting point, however, is that it has rarely, if ever, been demonstrated to have anything to do with evolution in the sense of long-term changes in populations. Summing up, we can see that the import of the Darwinian theory of evolution is just unexplainable caprice from top to bottom. Stanley Southey. There are people spouting off as if we know the answer. We don't know the answer, Stuart Kaufman. At that meeting, Francisco Ayala agreed with me when I stated that this doctrinaire, neo-Darwinism, is dead. He was a practitioner of neo-Darwinism, but advances in molecular genetics, evolution, ecology, biochemistry, and other news had led him to agree that neo-Darwinism's now dead. Now, you might note that museums haven't changed anything, and the science textbooks in your kids' high school haven't changed, right? And I would say you're right, they haven't, and you probably shouldn't expect them to change anytime soon. Because the point of this, the motivation was always about something bigger than science. It was about the elimination of God from the equation. And I can demonstrate that to you. We need to wrap up. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I am a truth seeker, as I said last week, and I hope that you are a truth seeker too. If you are someone who is inclined to find fault with the Bible, I want to propose something to you. And what I would propose to you is that you have been subtly conditioned to think that way. It's not your fault. You've been subtly conditioned to have a negative impression of the Bible. Since the beginning of the 20th century, secular humanism has been overtaking North America. There's been a very intentional plan in the works to remove God and the Bible from all areas of public life, especially education. Men like John Dewey, who created the Dewey Decimal System, were a big part of this. Men like Paul Kurtz, Isaac Asimov, that worked overtime to influence people in places of authority, in government, in education, in media. The Humanist Manifesto, 1933, the second one in 1973, and the Secular Humanist Declaration in 1980 have been the playbooks that have shaped American society. Similar to Marx's Communist Manifesto or Hitler's Mein Kampf, they have been used to transform all aspects of society: education, government policy, media, entertainment. There is a reason why, guys, if you're watching a movie, that Christians will never be portrayed in a good light in a movie, right? There's a reason why you will never hear a biblical perspective being promoted in media. These are very intentional developments. In our Renew groups this week, I'm actually going to have everyone look at these documents and see for themselves if they think that they may have contributed to the attitude that people have today toward the Bible. That's the exercise. So if you haven't been coming to group, you really want to be there this week. We're actually going to dig into the Humanist Manifestos and take a look at the influence that they've had. If you would like to participate in a group, you're not part of one, just let me know. We'll get you into one this week. But this is important stuff. We really want you to be able to study it at a proper level. Next week, I encourage you to join us again. Gatekeepers of Truth, who decided on the 66 books that are in the Bible. Let's pray. Father, I just want to ask you to work in each heart today as we consider this book, the Bible. Lord, I pray that you would just cause today's message to help people to give the Bible a second chance and to be open to the idea that maybe their thinking has been impacted in a way that maybe they didn't even realize, that maybe it stands the test of time and of truth better than they've been told. And I pray that they would just continue to come back over these next few weeks. Thank you for this time here today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Join us every Sunday at 10 a.m. at Cineplex Cinemas in Milton, or visit us online at renewchurch.ca/connect.